But because this is a very somber time, all of the toys are put away. The pianoforte, which was downstairs that had the obituary and that on it, that's covered and put away because it's not a happy time. And so all of that type of thing would have been closed up and locked away. And so it looks very bare in here. I'm not used to seeing it quite so bare, but it would have been that way. But this would have been a very comfortable space for 3 children. Now, when this house was built, the typical home in Edwardsville would have easily fit in one room of this house. Most people were living in a small brick home with maybe a second story or a log cabin with a loft, depended. So you've got a family who's living in that one-room log cabin who's going to be sharing a bed space like this. You've got a trundle bed underneath and then a main bed. You may have had pallets that you put down on the floor, but when you're living in a one-room log cabin, it's a multi-purpose space. So in here, you've got a bed for each child. This puts it in perspective to how comfortable the Stephensons were when they first moved into this house. Unfortunately, it didn't last. Ben only lived in the house 9 months before he dies. Lucy lives in the house for 12 years. She would have had what was called dower rights, and they couldn't take her house from her when he dies. He died without a will, threw everything into probate, and anything that was essential to her or her children's survival they couldn't take. So most of the items that we see on the inventory are items that are associated with him. Now this is that wool crate for bombazine. This is a child's dress, and it would have been a fairly comfortable garment, but this, is nice and dull. It's not, compared to mine, which has a little more of a sheen, this one's fairly dull, and that's what they wanted. A lot of their hats would have been trimmed in this. Now, children could have wore white, as I said, with black trim, and as you go through, adults go through mourning, you can start doing that probably about the 3rd stage of mourning. And then by the 4th stage, you're starting to add colors. But again, the boys could have been put into mourning garments, but a lot of times they just wore sashes around their hats, or again, the sashes around their arms, and it would have been the women who really were the ones that were going into full mourning. We also, if you didn't notice, we've got the black swag on the front of the house, and that's another public display. So you would have known immediately, walking up to this house, that someone had died in here. And then also seeing somebody with an armband on, you're obviously going to know they've lost someone. So, he's got any questions for me?
Well, clothing in that period typically wasn't really colorful anyway.
No, not usually. You'll see some women's gowns could get pretty colorful. You had cotton that was becoming readily available by the 1820s that was printed. Before that, you dealt with a lot of silks and a lot of wools, but cotton was becoming more affordable. Men's clothing tended to be darker. You'll see corduroy, but coats were usually black or blue. You'll see brown. You might see some greens. You'll see some reds, but earlier, like 1700s, men's clothing and women's clothing were just flamboyant. I mean, they were just off the wall colors. I've seen entire suits for men that are like this soft pink color that's just full of embroidery. So, it really kind of turned the corner in the early 1800s. But you had people like Beau Brummel. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He really changed the look of men's clothing, and even men's suits today are still highly influenced by what he started. He went from the what they called the foppish style, which was just, again, frilly and very what we would consider feminine, to the darker, somber colors, more tailored, and really changed men's style completely. But you were dealing with much more somber colors for men by this point. But women's clothing could get really outlandish as far as colors go, and they liked bright colors. They liked colors that were opposite each other on the color wheel. So you'll see really strange combinations of colors, and with women's clothing anyway. Men not so much, but women's clothing you could get pretty far out. Yeah. Any other questions?
No.
No? No. Okay. We'll move on. Now, even in here, it's hard to imagine that these windows would have been blacked out with fabric similar to what we have around the doors. So it would not have been anywhere near as bright as what we have right now.
Very somber.
Yes. And I can't imagine being like this for a year. It would be so depressing. About the time you would start to come out of your depression and your mourning, you're going to get you're just not going to, because it's gonna be so dark. And socially, you were not expected to go out, and people weren't supposed to come and visit necessarily. You couldn't entertain when you were in mourning either, so it, really would not have been a pleasant experience. Now in here, we have it set up as if the lawyers are here taking the inventory.
Okay.
Now, as I mentioned, he dies without a will. They had a $48,000 debt that Lucy was left with, not all his fault. Probably about $8,000 was personal debt, but Ben had been receiver of public monies at the land office, which was a very lucrative position. It was the highest producing land office in the country at the time. Unfortunately, he had deposited about $40,000 in the local bank. It was very easy to close a bank in the 1820s. You didn't have banking system like we do today, where you have the FDIC and everybody has a national currency. You would get backers to open a bank. All of the backers would provide the gold and silver that were going to be used to print your own money. You would create your own money. You had a couple different types of banking. The type of banking that was being done by the Edwardsville Bank at that time was called fractional banking, where if you had, say, $10,000 in backers, you had gold and silver, $10,000. Instead of printing just $10,000 worth of money, you print $20,000 worth of money. Well, that's what they did here in town. And the bank in St. Louis decided they were going to close the Bank of Edwardsville, because before the Bank of Edwardsville was built or established, Ben would take large sums of money over to the St. Louis Bank. Well, unfortunately, when they open this bank, it takes a lot of money from the St. Louis Bank. So what happens is the Bank of St. Louis decides they're going to collect as much of the paper money printed on the Bank of Edwardsville that they can. And they bring it over here and they cash it in. Well, when they cashed it in, they had to give them gold and silver in return. Well, it breaks the bank. So $40,000 of government money goes with the bank at that time. And Ben starts loaning money to people who have lost everything in the bank failure, which adds to his debt. And by the time he passes away, there's $48,000. And like I mentioned earlier, it's about $1 million, almost $1 million today. So they come in, they start inventorying everything that can be associated with Ben. Lucy's items are left alone, the children's items are left alone. But the one thing that could possibly be Lucy's items or associated with Lucy are a lot of the dishes. Now, Ben did operate a mercantile for a short period of time when they first moved to Edwardsville in 1816, for about a year and a half, I guess it was. Some of these could have been leftover inventory, but there's also a possibility that it was theirs and they just had them stored and it wasn't essential to Lucy's survival, so they could be sold. But the dishes, just plates alone, there were 8 dozen sets of plates on the inventory. That's a lot of dishes.
That's a lot.
But, and so we know how many wine glasses there were. There's some really weird things that are missing. There are only 4 brass candlesticks on the entire inventory, which is really unusual. So maybe they let her keep the other candles and the other types of lighting. There's no weapons of any kind. Ben and Lucy both grew up on the frontier. Their fathers had fought the Indians. Lucy's father was a well-known revolutionary. So, there's just, there was weapons in this house. There's no clocks, which was something you would have seen in a home like this. So there's just really odd things that are missing, and some of those could be attributed to her dower right. But now, with the phenomenal amount of dishes that are on the inventory, part of it could also be Ben and Lucy did enjoy entertaining. And in 1809, when they first moved into the territory, they threw a party that lasted for 4 days, and it made the St. Louis papers. It was a huge event. So I could see where you could go through a lot of dishes if you were having a party, because when you had a party, people came to your home, and they stayed for 3 or 4 days. They're not going to get in their buggies and go back home. You just, like we would today, you stayed.
Right.
So you go through a lot of...
It's not like it's an hour drive, it's a day's trip.
It's a drive, exactly. So, you're gonna go through a lot of stuff. And when you ate a meal at that time, especially at a party, you ate in courses. Usually when we go somewhere or we're eating at home, we sit down, we eat in one fell swoop, we're done. At that time, a meal could last for hours at a party because you're having various courses brought in, and it's part of the celebration. And I can see where they could go through a lot of dishes at that time. You don't have paper plates, you don't have a dishwasher. Well, you did. Someone who was working in the kitchen was your dishwasher. But you're going to go through a lot of stuff very quickly. So it's kind of interesting to look at the inventory, which we do have a copy of here that's been transcribed. So it's kind of neat, some of the stuff that are listed. And I think every time I look at it, I see something different that I didn't see before, but it will tell you.
Tables,
Mhm,
beds.
mhm. But it tells you what some of them were sold for. You know, like 8 dozens, you know, $12, or you know, it's kind of interesting to look at it and just see there's like dumbwaiters, which are tables like this. I think there's like 17 dumbwaiters, and I'm thinking, where would you put 17 dumbwaiters? Where are you going to keep all this stuff? So, and there's beds and there's draperies and I mean, just a lot of things. So it's kind of interesting to look at it. And Lucy did manage to buy some of it back. I'm gonna let that go if you're looking at that. But a lot of it was sold, and some of it was probably purchased by family and friends and then given back to Lucy. She was very well respected, and she tended to. Yes, ma'am. Do you need me? Oh, okay. I thought maybe you had something to tell me. So, you know, that was probably one way that she managed. But like I mentioned, she managed to stay in the house for 12 years after he dies. And then she finally sells the house for $2,000 to Elvira Edwards, who was at that time Ninian Edwards' widow. She moves to Carlinville, and that's where she remained until she passed away in the 1850s. So, you know, it was unfortunate.
They were, I guess, fairly well to do.
They were.
With all the stuff that
They were very well to do.
especially for the area they're in.
Yeah. And you know, when this house was built, it was probably one of a handful of houses that were like this. This would not have been your typical home in Edwardsville at the time. And
Probably even the whole.
St. Louis
area.
would have had some nicer houses because you had a well-established community there. You know, the Spanish had lived there, the French had lived there. So
I guess maybe Alton's fairly old. I don't know.
Yeah.
Was it there?
I think Alton, I think it came after, but not by much. Because I know when the Stevensons moved up, I think it was the furthest part, but it wasn't long that you know, Alton was coming up. Because they started Edwardsville in about 1809. The gentleman who laid out the tracts of land started that in 1809. But by 1820, it's fairly well established. There was probably 200 or 300 people here, which is by no means close to what you would have seen in St. Louis, but it would have been, you know, fairly comfortable. Yep.
Would you like me to close the door?
Yes, you can close that if you want to. What is it? We hadn't come out here yet, so we were going to come out. Are you going in there? No, we'll go this way. Okay, all right. All right. Cross into the courtyard. Come on in. I'm going to throw a little bit of wood on the fire.
Oh, wow.
Here.
Hey, it's nice.
It is nice out here. Now this is obviously our kitchen. Now in 1820, this building did not exist as a separate building. The kitchen was actually attached to the house. Now the section where you were watching the video and where the gift shop was and the 2 rooms above, that's that remodel. Originally in 1820, the building on the back of the house looked like this building. It was much smaller, it was only 1.5 stories. So if you would take off that 1840 section, you get rid of it and pick this building up and put it right there, you would have the whole 1820 house. They can if they want to come in, they can. I can do the kitchen if she wants to bring her in. That's fine, I don't care. Either way.
So she's comfortable doing the kitchen, but not the house.
Okay, well, they can do that. That's fine, that's fine. They can come in if she would rather I do the house, that's fine. Now this doorway, when we were in the dining room, well, we came through that doorway. This is the doorway going into the dining room. It was at the back of the room. So now upstairs, at the top of the stairs is a large window. That was the doorway at the back of the children's bedroom. So when you go up there, you'll see how, you know, it was kind of situated. But this would have been, you know, a nice kitchen to work in. Lots of space. Now the servants were probably the ones doing the majority of the work in the kitchen.
Doesn't look like our kitchen lot, does it?
A lot different than our kitchen. Now a lot of the stuff though we still have in our kitchens today. Many of the items that are in here, even though they look a little bit different, are still things that you would see in our kitchen. Now I don't have a microwave, but I have several ovens. I do have a beehive oven, or what would be called bustle oven, and this has no chimney inside of here. It's just like a brick box, and you would build a fire inside of it, and then when you're ready to use it, you scrape everything out so it's nice and clean, but the heat will remain in the bricks. So then you would slide whatever you were going to use, or whatever you were going to bake, into the oven.
So would they leave the door open while the fire was?
Yes,
smoke was
yep.
still up?
Yep, and it could go up, because if you shut the door, it blocks off the oxygen to the fire. Now, one thing about 1820 that's a little bit different today, when they were cooking in here in the 1820s, they almost always had a preheated oven.
Mhm.
Our problem today is we don't have a fire going 24/7 every day of the year. So when we have to use it, we have to really get a hot fire in there, and it's got to burn for several hours. Whereas in 1820s, there was always a fire out here. So you always had some residual heat in there. But we don't have that today. Now, if you guys, you're from town, right? Okay. Have you eaten out of Peel?
Mhm.
Okay, very similar to Peel, where you've got the big wood-fired oven that they use for cooking. Now, for us to use this oven very effectively, we almost do what Peel does, and we build a tiny little fire in the very back of the oven, and it makes it a little bit easier for us to use because we just can never get it hot enough to make it effective. And I don't know if there's something wrong with the way it's made, because I've used brick ovens before, but this one just never gets hot enough without a fire in the back. But this was one oven.
So how often does this get used here?
Well, we can use this every day. We try not to do too much with wood if we don't need to, because wood's so expensive and we never seem to have enough of it. But we'll do cooking demonstrations in here. We make our own candles in here. So we try to do things that you would have seen. So it gets used a lot. When we have our chimneys cleaned, this is the one that takes the longest because it's used constantly. So it does get a workout in here. But we've got Dutch ovens, we've got a reflector oven that's used for making meat, like you buy the rotisserie chickens and Deerbergs, you can do all kinds of meat on here.
So would that get put next to the fire or hung
What
up?
this does is you would have on your spit your meat, whatever you're gonna cook, chicken, turkey, whatever. And then this goes toward the fire. So what's happening is the heat is reflecting off the back of your oven. And you've got a spit that's on a crank, you can move it. You can do two small hens, probably in about 2 hours, and they make the best chicken. I mean, whatever meat you put on here is super moist. It does not dry it out. And if you wanted to use some of your drippings to baste it or whatever, everything's going to get caught down here in the bottom. And you just check it by opening this door. It would be kind of inconvenient to have to go like this every time you want to check something. But it's wonderful. The only thing I don't like about this is it's really hard to clean it.
I bet.
It's a job and a half. So, but it's wonderful. And then you've got your standard Dutch ovens, which are kind of your 3 pots in one. You've got a stew pot, you've got an oven, and if all else fails, you've got a skillet. I'm turning this upside down and putting it on a spider, which is what this is called, or 2 stones or something. You've got a skillet. But it would work very effectively for baking bread or a cake, whatever. If you're living in a 1-room log cabin and you don't have a bustle oven yet, these are just as great as using one of these. The only difference is you can cook several things at once in a bigger oven. That's just a pantry.
Oh.
And you would maybe store some of the dishes that Lucy had. There might have been food in there. We've got a lot of modern things like our fire extinguisher in there. There's also one that's hidden underneath the stairwell, same thing. So you would have had little closets in here that you would have kept things in. And with all the dishes she had, there's no furniture on the inventory that shows where she stored things. So I think that she probably kept some stuff in here. Now, but it would have been a fairly active spot. I'm sure the servants were working in here before the sun came up and long after the sun went down and getting ready for the next day. So it would have been a very active spot. Any questions?
I found it interesting about the indentured servants.
That is probably my favorite side of the house because it's such an interesting history, but unfortunately, slave history tends to be very oral, and it's hard to research oral histories. So we have managed to find quite a bit about the servants. I can tell you their names, ages, when some of them were freed. We found 2 emancipation papers. So it's interesting, but it's been a lot of research, and there's still so much more we don't know. But now a lot of people, I've had people come in and argue with me that we didn't have slaves in Illinois. Yes, we did. This was a free state, it was a free territory, that's true. But they allowed indentured servitude. And indentured servitude in Illinois was your loophole against the slavery laws. And they knew it. When legislation was written, they knew they were going to allow indentured servitude because they figured if they absolutely forbid any slavery of any kind in Illinois, they'd never get the population base up to make it a state. And when they opened it up down by Kentucky. Yeah, Kentucky. And people were waiting. So you've got a lot of Southerners that were coming into the territory. Not every Southerner owned a slave, but you had Southerners who did, who had money. They're coming into Illinois, and if you said you can't bring your slaves, they're not coming. So what they would do is they would bring them into the territory. They had 30 days to register them. They would take them to a courthouse. They would register them as an indentured servant, which was perfectly legal. Anybody, regarding of your race or your age, could be indentured. You could indenture your daughter if you needed the money. You know, you could indenture them to someone, maybe a tradesman or a tradeswoman, and you would hope that the person would teach them a trade to some extent, so that when their indenture was up, they could actually have a living. That wasn't necessarily the case. They would oftentimes, you know, be used as a slave, and you know, so it's not the best situation, but you know, unfortunately, it's what happened, and it happened a lot. And you'll see on indenture papers anywhere from 4 years to 99 years. In reality, they weren't supposed to be set free. It was just a legal means of keeping them bound to you. And when Lucy and Ben came into the territory, they had 3 slaves that they registered. 2 of them came from Lucy's father's estate. She had inherited them. And Tobe, who was, he had about 4 years to serve on his indenture. And apparently he was set free at the end of that 4 years. In many cases, though, right before an indenture was up, the slaveholder would take the individual over to St. Louis and sell them at auction and get their money out of them because they were property, they were an investment. And even here, you know, Lucy started a school for the free blacks in the area. She was, you know, I like to think she was good to her servants, but I can't tell you that for sure. I just can see letters that she's written, things that she did. So I hope that she was, but you know, we really can't say for sure how things work here. And I've lost my train of thought what I was going to go with that. So yeah, I'm sorry, my brain's gone.
Would the floor have been brick when it was part of the house?
Probably not. It was probably wood because right underneath this room would have been the cellar, and where you were sitting when you watched the video, the cellar is still there. Okay. So more than likely it was wood. So you would have had probably a hearthstone out here that you could have brought stuff out onto, but it would not have been all brick like this. I doubt seriously because that would have been a lot of weight to support above that cellar. So it was probably wood. And in some cases you'll see dirt. I know they wouldn't have had dirt here because again you had a cellar directly underneath you.
Elaine, I'm gonna get you one of these so you can make us butter.
It's actually kind of fun when you make butter like that. We do that a lot. You're thinking, yeah, whatever.
Wow, this is a very narrow staircase.
Yes, it's very narrow and very steep. Now this is our interpretation of the servants' quarters. Now, when the Stephensons built this house, there was already a log cabin on the property. Ben had it dismantled and it was brought closer to the house. We know that there was a family of servants that lived here. It's pretty typical to have a separate quarters for your servants. There was a chimney put into it, a fireplace put into it. We have all of the bills for that. And that's probably where they lived. Now this back section of the house would not have been the most habitable. You're dealing with your roof right here. It's going to be cold in the winter, hot in the summer. You've got a doorway that goes into the children's bedroom right here where the window would have been. And that doorway would have been kept shut because you don't want your uninsulated roof bringing cold air into the children's bedroom. Right. So it would have been relatively miserable back here. Now this time of year is not bad because it's cool and it stays fairly cool. But cold or hot, it's going to be extreme. And in the summertime, it's just, people don't stay up here very long because it's like a sauna.
I bet.
Now, being in the back part of the house like this, there was no heat source. You don't have a fireplace in here. You have the chimney. Your only heat's gonna come from downstairs because that chimney's never gonna get hot enough to keep this room warm.
Right.
So I could see anybody who was living in this part of the house going downstairs and putting pallets on the floor in the wintertime and sleeping, or in the summertime going outside and sleeping, because this was just not a nice place to live. It's very simple in here, just like their home would have been, you know, if they were living in that cabin. You're not gonna have a whole lot, you're not being paid for the work that you're doing. So your only money that you might have received was if you had a 1 day off a week, say it's Sunday, you could have a choice. You go to church or you hire yourself out to someone else, and then you could get paid for what you did. But during the week, you didn't get paid. You know, you're basically clothed. They purchase clothes. We have records for that for the servants, and you're fed, and that's it. And you know, you work because you are a slave. And so, very simple. Things that might not be good any longer in the main house are what you were going to get out here. You know, china that might have been chipped, you know, they would give it to the servants. So you didn't have a whole lot. It's very simple, very sparse.
This structure here was built when it was restored.
Yes, yes. Because when they started the restoration, they knew that that back section of the house was an 1840 remodel. And they really contemplated tearing that 1840 section off and putting the kitchen right there. I'm glad they didn't, because really that has its own historical significance. So they opted to build a separate kitchen, which is pretty typical. You see that a lot in older homes, especially southern homes, and the Stephensons were southerners. So I could see where they could have easily had a separate kitchen, but we've found no evidence for it at this point. Even here, you know, you'll see older homes that have, you know, separate kitchens, which are no longer used as separate kitchens, but they would have been at one time. And, you know, it would have been pretty typical to see something like this.
I was just wondering where they would have gotten, because this lumber is nothing like what you go to Lowe's and
Yeah.
buy.
Well, the
So
gentlemen who built the house, or not built the house, who did the restoration on the house are the ones that did this building. And they specialize in,
They would have had to have that custom cut.
yeah, and they probably did, because they were pretty good at being accurate. And, you know, that's
it's
what.
even got that rough hewn kind of look.
Yeah, I don't know where they got it. I know it was built in 2005, and it was ready to go by the time we opened in 2006.
Yeah, that's the thing that struck me looking at it. It's like, it doesn't look like
Yeah.
modern lumber.
No, it doesn't. They did a really good job. I mean, this is built to look old, and like it would have been in the 1820s. I mean, it's meant to look like it would have been. So they did a good job.
Neat.
Is that to make clothes?
That is a spinning wheel, and what you would do is you would make the thread that would ultimately be woven into fabric or into blankets. But I'm not a spinner, so I can't demonstrate it for you. But it would start out being, this is wool, and it's been carded, and it's been cleaned, and you can touch it if you want to. You also had flax. Now this is flax as it grows, but they'll beat this down, and it'll get fibery like this. And I would like to have some. I need to get some made or get some done. And they would weave that or spin that.
Did they use cotton?
I don't know if they had cotton here. I know you'll see a lot of wool and you'll see a lot of flax, but I don't know about cotton in this area. And not everybody had a spinning wheel, so you don't see, you know, these wouldn't have been in everybody's houses. And once you spun it, you might take it to someone to weave, and you would end up with, you know, a blanket or fabric like cotton or linen. And this is how it would have come out. But this would have been completely full.
Foot pedal to make it.
Yep. They would start it off. And I love to watch people spin, but you get it started. Well, I guess we're going the wrong way. There we go. There we go. And then you can just keep it going with your foot. And we also have a great big one that's called a walker. And it's huge. It's like this. And what they would do with it, it didn't have a pedal. And you would start it spinning, and then you would walk away from it, spinning your thread. And then you'd walk back. You'd spin it again, and you'd walk away from it. So it was probably the 1820 treadmill, because, you know, you're walking back and forth a lot.
Yeah.
But that's what it is. It's for keeping that going. But it's almost hypnotic to watch somebody who can spin. I love to watch them because it's just very hypnotic to watch them do it. And the sound of it is very hypnotic.
And you know where wool comes from, right?
Yeah.
This is the tallest staircase I've ever.
Me too.
Yeah, you don't want to go up that in the dark really fast. She'll come back down really fast.
Yeah.
And you trip.
That's right. Every once in a while, we'll get school kids in here that come down a little bit too quick and they'll hit that curve and it'll be like, "Tuk, tuk, tuk, tuk." It's like, oh, I'm just waiting for somebody to hit the bottom. Well, that is pretty much it, guys. If you want to go back in and look around at the exhibit, because I